Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about functions. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, why do we use function in programming? My boss argues that you should only create a function if you are going to use it somewhere else. Is that true? No. Well, it depends. This is where I can say no, and there will be a million reasons why yes, because it very much depends on the code. It's similar to should you always use functional programming or should you use object-oriented programming? Is one better than the other? And you can make the argument from different angles where, well, if you're going to support immutability, that's a very good thing from one perspective, but from a performance perspective, it might not be as good as mutating things or mutating references. This is something that where it's practically impossible to answer this accurately because it very much depends on the context that you find yourself in. An example would be if you're going to create the lowest memory footprint that you can possibly make. Well, then yes, the less functions, or like the more concise the code you can write, the better. The less it's the same with allocating variables. Like, should you create a bunch of variables? Well, yeah, it might matter, it may not matter. One thing that I think is interesting though is that, sure, from the perspective of uh, efficiency, creating a function may not be the best thing in the world because you have more code. And if you only use a function in one place, it might not be the best thing. But if we flip that to its extreme and say that, okay, but at what point is comprehension something that is more important? Because there is a branch of programmers who I think I think that we basically call them declarative programmers, where, or is it procedural programming, or that style of working, where you might have people who, and worked with people like that, who have a value system where, well, everything should just live in one big massive function. And if you talk about clean code and code cleanliness, some people will tell you that, well, having a function that is more than, I don't know, 50 lines of code or something like that, it's an anti-pattern because you're creating so much logic in one single block of logic or one function or whatever in your program that it's hard to figure out what's going on. But on the flip side, that is also, it depends, right? Because there are situations where that style of working or the writing code in that fashion might be the right thing. So this is where the art, I would say, and experience in many ways comes into play, where there is no there is no right answer here. I can give you my perspective. I can say that, well, if unless you have very, very strict performance requirements on the code that you are writing, then creating a function that abstracts away a piece of logic in maybe a big chain of things might actually create a much better reading experience and comprehension experience for the person who is reading. An example that I see quite often is that I see people create a function that might be doing a bunch of stuff. You may take in some raw data, do some pre-processing, and then create a few logical operations on that data and then return a result. And they create that in one single function. And I always ask them, why are you, like, you have all these filters on this array and these mutations that you're doing, and you're like extracting data. Put that into a function. So instead of having like 10 lines of transformation code that gets me the value that I need to do the thing that this function is actually supposed to be doing, move that into a helper function. So there's a one-liner saying, oh, pre-processed data equals output. And then you can take that output and do the actual thing that you're supposed to be doing. Because now I don't have to, because when I am, at least me, as the reader, I don't necessarily care about how you do the pre-processing. All I want to understand is, what is this function doing? How is it, like, why is it behaving this way? And it might become easier for me to understand that if you create a very well named function that explains that it's doing something, rather than forcing me to just look at this blob of logic that you have created. And so what you're doing is that you're actually segmenting down. It's very in many cases it's very similar to adding comments or helper comments for sections of code where you're trying to explain what you're doing, because in some cases what you're doing is actually very complicated. And one of the surest ways for you to create bugs and problems in a system is to create code that is very incomprehensible. But as I said, that also assumes that you have the luxury of wasting those extra bits that you're putting into creating functions and that extra abstraction and so forth. If you can't afford that sort of thing, then you don't really have a choice. And then maybe just adding a comment is the best thing, because at least a comment you can extract out of the resulting code, and it will still sort of help you segment things and like break them down so that a reader can understand what's going on. So what I want you to take away from this is that there is absolutely a validity to saying that, well, you should only use functions if you're going to use them twice. But at the same time, it might be completely false, because the average software developer, at least if you're a web developer, you're not going to work in an environment where you have such enormous requirements on performance that having an unnecessary function or something that is really only for comprehension is a bad thing. You can take that to the extreme as well. I've seen people who do, and this is horrible, I think at the very least, where they go crazy, where they're trying to like they're basically going to the other side, where they're trying to create logic that reads like a book, or like that is perfectly comprehensible. I've seen people have a function that has 3 other functions inside of it, or maybe just one function, so that they can get the perfect function name. And then you're just creating layers and layers of abstraction, which creates a different problem, because as I was saying, in my example, I was just reading the main function, and we were talking about a helper within that function. But what if I needed to understand what the helper was doing? And if you have 3, 4, 5 nestings of other logic that is going on, it might actually make it even harder for me to understand what's going on. And that is a very personal preference, because I have been working with developers who say, I hate it when people create these super functions, and some go, I actually like that, because now I can follow along in the entire program. It is really hard to say which is better. All I can tell you is that in some cases, yes, creating unnecessary abstractions is a very bad thing, and you can solve a lot of that by just having comments or things like that. But in some cases, clean code kind of necessitates that you create some abstraction, and this is where you kind of have to feel it out. As with experience and doing enough coding and getting inspired from different types of people and different perspectives, you're going to find your own style. It's I had a friend who once said, I can teach you to walk, but you have to find your way of walking. And I think I will tell you the same thing. You're going to have to figure this out on your own, where the sweet spot is when you write your software. Have a great day.